All right,
Okay,
Mary, we'll begin with Mary Dunn introducing our panelists. Please, Mary.
okay, great. Well, thank you, Tuan, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us on this June morning or evening, depending on where you are in the world. I know we have, as Tuan mentioned before we started, a truly international or global panel here. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Mary Dunn. I am a professor of early modern Catholic history at St. Louis University, and I'm currently, for 2025, the president of the ACHA. So together with Tuan Hoang, professor at Pepperdine University and scholar of Vietnamese Catholicism, I am very happy to see you all here for the second of three virtual meetings on the theme of global Catholicism. So some of you may have been here, but we last met in March for a shared discussion of Erin Rowe's article, After Death, Her Face Turned White, Blackness and Sanctity in the Early Modern Hispanic World. We had a great discussion. It was really fun. And at that meeting, when we concluded, we asked people for what they might be interested in for our next two planned virtual meetings. And one thing that came up was a potential panel on archives that support research in global Catholicism. So accordingly, Tuan and I would say here, mostly Tuan, this was mostly Tuan's excellent organization, put together this panel of two archivists, Rob Carbonneau and Patrick Hayes, and two researchers, Bubbles Beverly Asor and Maria Teresa Fattori, all of whom will share their experiences either managing and running, operating Catholic archives, or conducting research in them. So I know we're going to learn a lot from them, not least of which, and I think it's interesting that the panel shook out this way, about the supposed rift or divide between the scholars and archivists. So what we're going to do this morning or this evening is go on for about 90 minutes. Each panelist will do about a 15, maybe 20-minute presentation, and then we'll leave some time for Q&A. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our four panelists. So first, and I'm going to introduce them all, and then we'll just turn to the presentations. First, Rob Carbonneau is a Passionist priest, an affiliated research fellow of the Ricci Institute for Chinese Western Cultural History at Boston College, where he curates the Passionist China collection. As an adjunct professor of theology, he teaches revolutionaries, diplomatic theology, and Catholic missionaries in 20th century China, and a course called American Asian Catholics, Journey of Faith and Theology. Next, we'll hear from Maria Teresa Fattori, who's a researcher at the University of Teramo in the project NECTEX, Networks and Exchanges within the Congregations of the Roman Curia. Her current work focuses on the relationship between the Catholic Church and slavery in the early modern period. She's published extensively on the history of the early modern Roman Curia, the development of canon law after the Council of Trent, and the history of global Catholicism. Third, we will be hearing from Patrick Hayes, who's a former member of the ACHA Executive Committee and a member for nearly 30 years of the ACHA. He's the author or editor of 6 books and numerous articles and book chapters. His last teaching assignment was at the University of McKinney in Sierra Leone. Since 2008, Patrick has served as the archivist for the Redemptorists in the United States and worked on projects related to Native American boarding schools, Catholic records and slavery, and 3 canonization causes. And finally, we will have a presentation from Bubbles Beverly Asor, who's an assistant professor with the Department of Sociology at the University of the Philippines at Diliman. She received her PhD in sociology from the National University of Singapore, and her research interests are in migrant organizations, religion and migration relations, the Catholic Church as a migrant-serving mediating structure, everyday Catholic life, labor migration, and international migration in South Korea. So welcome everybody, and I'm going to turn it over now to Rob.
Well, thank you very much, Mary, and Tuan for putting this together. My observations on global Catholicism and archival organization and research are going to be dealing with structure of an archives, but the implications that I've come to see in archival research as is expanding now into global Catholicism. So, first of all, the Passionist China collection is at the Ricci Institute for Chinese Western Cultural History at Boston College, And as I reflect on this, I'm going to be calling it the PCC for Passionist China Collection. The collection, just as an overview, has 16,000 photos and over 60,000 reports and correspondence. It documents the Passionist coordinated mission to Hunan, China from 1921 to 1955. The PCC is part of a larger Passionist historical archive, and in 2026, this larger Passionist historical archive, which is now being has a good home at the University of Scranton. In 2026, we have planned to move it to the Catholic Religious Archives now at Boston College. That's going to be taking place, and we're in process of figuring out the timetable of the move, but that we look forward to that. First of all, I want to just reflect on something about global Catholicism. And I'm doing this as a structural idea, but also where my thought process in engaging with archival material is leading me into the future. And I think perhaps other archivists and other researchers. So I'm combining two hats that I've worn over the years. First of all, global Catholicism, as I look at it, has made me stop and think with the larger corpus of the Passionist historical archives. They arrived in the United States in 1852. So I've often thought, if anyone's familiar with the Passionists in the United States, we have a monastery in Pittsburgh and Union City. One is operative still. Pittsburgh, Union City is closed, but both dominate the skyline. And I was thinking in terms of global Catholicism, if I was going to invite scholars to look at this archive, I would ask them to look at this archive as an international global narrative where rather than a domestic narrative. If we look at these monasteries as a pre-1908 mission experience, propaganda fide relinquished opportunities in 1908, how would we define the architecture, the landscape? I think one area that the archives across the board here show is that researchers and archivists tend to think only in their domestic stroke of a research and ideas. Very rarely do we keep seeing it as an international global mission. So I think in the United States, looking this as a pre-1908 story is a very key aspect to keep opening up us as a global experience, not just a linear forward movement of American Catholicism. But let me now turn to the Passionist China collection, and I'll ask Tuan to put up the image there, please. First of my images here. Tuan, if you can put up the PowerPoint, there we go, and frame it large if possible, full large. So this here, the Passionist China collection really is documents, and this is the structure of the archive, documents and photography that reset the overall terminology. And in this particular situation, you see the Passionists in the 1926 idea. And one of the perceptions here is the resources are asking for a nuance of change. So the documentation is asking us to look, instead of an imperialistic narrative of mission, to reinvent and re-deal with these sources and look at a more nuanced idea. First of all, the material as it's constructed in the archive and is seeing that gospel witness and self-sacrifice and self-respect are critical to the understanding of the missionaries themselves. And that's another factor. Also, the acceptance of civic and government agencies are seen from the Chinese population that was in absolute disarray. And in contrast, also, this image here shows the rejection also at times was possible of missionaries. I'm showing images because in the last 10 years, this whole Passionist China collection has been digitized and there's metadata available. So people who want to look at the Passionist the Passionist China collection, they can now look at documents and now they can see complementary material such as these slides. And this is totally reframing how archives are being given to researchers and how archives are being used. Also, this idea of Rice Christians. My interpretation of this is the best way to say this is the missionaries in feeding people in this, at least in the China situation, and I would ask if this is not worldwide, the missionaries were themselves in the same famine motif, famine experience as the people they were feeding. This was not just a conversion experience. This was a human life experience. So I think that idea of Rice Christians, which has gone with the imperialistic narrative or at times colonial narrative, has to be revisited. The last thing I would say, and this might be true for archives and global Catholicism at large, it seems to me that at least in 2025, no one cares about China and everyone cares about China. And I wonder in terms of archival management in the respective areas that we might say those types of frames of interest sort of give an understanding of how we understand our collections. In terms of the idea here of the PCC, the Passionist China Collection, the correspondence and the photos together identify Sign Magazine, which was a Passionist magazine from 1921 to 49, exclusively dealing with China and global Catholicism and domestic Catholicism. So this is a complex narrative that's woven together. In the global and domestic narrative, what we have in Sign Magazine, and this comes alive, is photos, and these types of photos on China were giving an image to the American public of China. We have missionaries writing articles. We have global Catholic stories actually ending up, you might say, in the living room or the dining room of the readers in the United States. It develops into a world journalism narrative. So this Passionist China collection actually is an invitation to examine world journalism just as an entity in itself through the documents and the letters and the correspondence and the movement of the sources to the magazine. It also deals with issues such as international communism, international sense of democracy, and how archives hold the story of these international frameworks coming together. There's also war and survival narratives that are incorporated into the Sign Magazine. Sign Magazine and the PCC and the archival data are all together at once. And then there's missionary philanthropy, home support, and prayer. So all of these are key to the Passionist China collection. This China collection models other collections on China, which are in Gary Tiedemann's book, A Reference Guide to Christian Missionary Societies in China, 2009, and Angie Drees' Missionary Movement in American Catholic History in 1998, and other scholars such as Joseph Ho, Margaret Kuo, Anthony Clark, Wu Shaoxin, and a young scholar, Greta Fry, are looking at this and really looking at it in a new model of global Catholicism and local Catholicism. I'd like to turn to the second slide, please. One of the questions that was asked of me is, what is my favorite part of the whole Passionist China collection, and how does it relate to global Catholicism? This is a slide of Father Cormac Shanahan. You see the red image there in the slide. He was a member of the China Press Party, and the Passionist China collection has his diary. He actually went to visit Mao Zedong in 1944, and he represented the Catholic press. He represented Sign Magazine, and in that visit, he was trying to assess the relationship of Mao Zedong to the Chongqing nationalist government and actually to the world. he visited in person with Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong, and he said it appears to be the last Catholic Mass at the Yan'an Church before the Lucian Academy was founded in 1930, after the Lucian Academy was founded in 1937. So he met with Catholics there, and on the way out, he was debriefed by U.S. diplomats then in Xi'an in 1944. This is an important image for a couple of reasons. Number one is I think a lot of these different collections can be actually re-looked at in civil archives in relationship and also international archives, for example, like Foreign Relations of the United States. This event is in Foreign Relations of the United States, the Yan'an Press Party. So it's important.
Just FYI, 5 minutes left.
Okay, so I'd like to go to the third slide. And this, I think, is a very important image. It shows the fragile relationship on how to look at global Catholicism in cultural attire, bridge building, literally and figuratively, market currency, fluctuations, local people, sisters and priests, and working together, and how this comes together in the collection. And it's also international faith. And let me go to the next slide. This gets into the key of the collection. How does the collection deal with faith in international war? The missionaries engage locally. They work across culture. There's the idea of looking through the collection and asking about persecution versus suffering versus internment versus martyrdom, the saints of suffering, the shifts between Protestants and Catholic, and interfaith cooperation. Let me go to the next slide. Then there's the idea of traveling. Tourists now in global Catholicism. The global Catholic world of the 20th century is not the global world of the 21st century. Global Catholics also in metadata through the China Historical Christian Database offer now world collections. This is at BU, and metadata now that's available through these archives is repositioning the whole narrative. How do we ask and have it come together into the future? So the last couple comments I would make is the Passionist mission gave life to Jamaica, West Indies, Philippines, Japan, Korea, and what happens in the future as we see these global connections coming out of one archive, and how do we assess it? Citizenship is important, and move to the last idea here, the last slide. And then we move to global Catholicism and environmental issues. We can deal with new issues. Thomas Berry, who's a famous Passionist environmental and theological scholar, went to China in 1948, and he gained an insight of his environmental world by looking at China to some degree. And so my last observation, you can take down the slide, please. My last observation that I would say is religious archives now offer economic and human investment in the way it's cataloged and opportunity for global Catholicism. They invite researchers actually to give to a new generation on an intellectual journey. I think also there's a crisis because people who look at religious archives often don't have a faith experience or piety experience. And is there a conversion opportunity here? And then what comes first, local Catholicism or world Catholicism? And then the last aspect I would ask is, do these archives, how do they relate to Catholic media? How are they used or exploited by Catholic media? How do they educate with Catholic media? How do they sustain or sanctify justice in human and environmental life? So archives arrangement and investment is now a wide open field in the way that we order it now, and it's not the way it used to be. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Rob, thank you so much. Such a wealth of materials and information and food for thought. I want to move to Maria Teresa Fattori now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will share my presentation and maybe tell me if you hear me. and if you see my presentation also.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this online seminar and for giving me the opportunity to present the Roman Central Archives for Historical Research. My personal research aims to provide a global survey on the position of enslaved people within the worldwide Catholic Church from the mid-16th century to the end of the 19th century. I seek to transcend the fragmented approach of scholarships by an analyzing of different sources and wider contexts in a global setting. Although the Catholic Church developed the doctrine of its universalism, it was a local agency capable of acting at various social and geographic levels. My project aims to address the following points. First, how missionaries' critiques of slavery could coexist with the Church's widespread acceptance of enslavement, and second, by reconstructing the base that occurred in both the colonies and Rome, I emphasize the need to fully understand documents produced by central Roman institutions, as well as petitions filled by missionaries and particularly Capuchin friars, critics of slavery. The objectives of my project are to provide answer to the following questions. How was the question of African and American slavery viewed from Roman perspective, including the Curial Congregation and the papacy? What was the position of the so-called permanent neophytes in universal Catholicism? By permanent neophytes, I mean the indigenous non-Catholic-born or mixed-blood Catholics. Third, how did the religious life of the enslaved people manifest in their approach to the sacraments? What limitations and possibility did they face? What protection did they have, and how deep was their discrimination? What opportunities did they have to access the faith, and how did their religious life manifest? Were they integrated into the Catholic community, or did they remain marginalized? Fourth question. Finally, I intend to examine the Catholic criticism of slavery and the Catholic minority tradition against slavery, with a focus on the missionary activities. I spent most of my time in the Central Roman Archives in Vatican City. In fact, I drew an extensive archival documentation from the Roman institution, the Apostolic Vatican Archive, before 2019 called Secret Archive, Archivio Segreto, the Archive of the Holy Office, and the Archive of the Congregation de Propaganda Fide. The Apostolic and Vatican Archives, my first and most important archives, is an enormous collection of archives and archival funds that is almost impossible to summarize in a few words. It was founded in 1612 by Paul V, open to scholars in 1881. I can provide some figures: 1,000 years of history, 85 kilometers of shelving, 400 years of existence, millions of paper and parchments dated from the 1st century of the Christian era to 1958, the end of the pontificate of Pius XII. The Archivio Apostolico Vaticano is the central archive of the Holy See and contains the historical archives from various private and public institutions, either because of their scope or because they were intentionally sent by documents producers. These various archives make up the over 600 collection of the Archivio Apostolico and can be grouped into the following categories: Office and Curia, Papal diplomacy, families and individuals, general and ecumenical council, provincial councils and synods, religious institutions, order and archconfraternities, miscellaneous collections. The Apostolic Archive also keeps the document produced or received by the Curial Congregation founded in 1588 onwards, with some exceptions. It also keeps documents produced by medieval Roman tribunals and other curial organizations created to serve the papacy. The first Curial congregation to be founded was the Holy Office, which has always had its own and distinct archive due to its importance. For my research in the Serious Secretary of State and in the Nunciatures of Madrid and Lisbona are particularly important, containing correspondence, reports, encrypted documents, so on and so forth. You can find the original Italian names in the first instrument of the disposal of the scholars in the Sala Indici, the room of the inventories. Apostolic Archives inventories are called index as the Apostolic Archive was a book. Then the Roman Tribunal of the Holy Office, Archivio del Dicastero per la Dottrina della Fede, with the acronym ADDF. In 1542, the Tribunal of the Inquisition was refounded as the Roman Holy Office. Initially established in the Middle Ages to combat heresy, this tribunal emerged with renewed force against the Protestant Reformation to become the highest Catholic authority on matters of faith and doctrine, and the first permanent congregation. The Holy Office served as a tribunal with jurisdiction over various crimes of faith, confessional disputes, heterodox practices, criticism raised against papacy and the Catholic Church. When Iberian missionaries and theologians began to express doubts about the legitimacy of the slave trade in the 16th century, the matter was entrusted to the Holy Office. The Holy Office archives, particularly the series Santa Storica, literally historical room, contains documents relating to missionary activity. For example, it contained doubts presented or questions raised by apostolic prefects from around the world, as well as normative decisions and reports on the decision-making process of cardinals, inquisitor, and pope. I would like to emphasize the importance also of the serie dubia circa sacramenta or other sacramental doubts, with focus on specific sacraments or capable to cover a wide range of questions. Third archive, Archivio Storico della Congregazione de Propaganda Fide, with the acronym APF. The Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith, the Propaganda Fide, was founded in 1622. It was established service to supervise and coordinate Catholic evangelizing activity on a global scale. Missionaries working in Americas, Africa, Asia, and Australia wrote to the cardinals of the congregation to ask for guidance and economic support on this unrepresented task, which involve encountering diverse religions and culture across a vast geographic area. From 1658 onwards, Propaganda Fide was required to forward doubts received on matters of faith, doctrine, and sacraments to the Holy Office. The Holy Office thus gained jurisdiction over questions of slavery based on inquiries from missionaries around the world, either concerning the conversion of enslaved persons to Catholicism or cases involving Catholic enslavers, both owners and traders. I show you the official list of funds. The archive contains correspondence between Cardinal and the Secretary of the Congregation, as well as missionary reports, original letters, drawings, pictures written and collected by the missionary, and the normative decision of the Cardinal, which were sometimes taken in collaboration with the Pope. It also keeps the proceeding of the meetings of the congregation members, called acta. Now I show you two diagrams presenting two different situations. The first is from Congo and the second one from Brazil. These archives allow researchers to examine how Roman institutions responded to missionary petitions from Brazil, Angola, Congo, and other places of the world. How the Central Papal Institution negotiated with Iberian and French political powers regarding the means of evangelization, and how missionary activity was developed within the confines of its limitations and possibilities. But these archives allow historians to find also documents produced from the bottom up by enslaved people and indigenous faithful native from America, Africa, and Asia, or clerics and missionaries reporting on these realities. I cannot neglect the importance of the Portuguese overseas archives or the Imperial Spanish and French archives. Given that the majority of the anti-slavery missionaries belonged to the Capuchin orders, I have conducted extensive research in the central and provincial Capuchin archives also. However, none of these additional archives provided answers as comprehensive as those from the central archives of the Apostolic See. The Roman Center was a polycentric and stratified sum of institutions. Early modern Catholicism was a polyphonic entity, where distinct actors, while acknowledging the Pope's supremacy, pursued divergent interests. Each petition from colonial territories was scrutinized by multiple Rome-based experts, often resulting in varied assessment. Recognizing this complexity is essential to understand the Catholic position on slavery and maybe also on other subjects. Preparing a visit in the Apostolic Archive is not easy. Before planning a visit to these archives, it is important to consider some practical aspects. In this moment, I will concentrate on the previous understanding of the organization of these archives. Scholars are not allowed to reproduce documents using their own equipment when they are in these three archives. Digital reproduction can be requested and paid for from the internal offices. Some useful but ancient instruments for consultation are only available via computers in the archives. Ancient and more modern inventories are available in the consultation rooms. On the Apostolic Archive, it is also possible to find information through its own page, also in English translation. Then I found also an Italian presentation on YouTube, and I announce you a new guide that is a sort of project in progress. The Archivio Apostolico started in 2009 to edit an online Guida dei Fondi. It will be an online Guida ready in the next few months. This guide is designed to be periodically updated to reflect the archive's continuous growth. Then you can also find important publication. I will share all this information, but you can also find this information, this bibliographical information inside the Indice dei Fondi relativi mezzi della descrizione, which is the first indication. And also are available publication, partial presentation of funds and document dedicated to certain areas. For example, America Pontificia, a guide on the America Latina, other guide on the Africa del Nord, Asia and Oceania, and so on and so forth. You have a list, but this list is very, very concentrated. Preparing a visit to the Archivio del Dicastero per la Dottrina della Fede, so the Archive of the Holy Office, is also very complicated. This archive opened to the public since 1998. The congregation was founded in 1542. The latest available documents date from 1958. The fonts, serial, and individuals' files have been inventoried in paper records and in a database called Shades, which is only available on site. In the official homepage of the archives, there are also partial descriptions of the documents that are available, I think, only in Italian. And that documents can be divided in three main series: Holy Office, Index, so the congregation which worked on the book censorship, and Siena, the Inquisition of Siena. A selection of documents can also be consulted in the digital edition on the website of my project, NetEx, or Digital Inquisition on Inquisition Net, only from the Serie Decreta and Santa Storica. You can see here a sort of screen that show you what you can see with the digital edition of the document on the website of my project. Is it also possible to see a brief presentation of the most important data present in this document, so names and subject, quotation of other sources, place, and so on and so forth. Final archive, preparing a visit to the Archivio of the Congregazione di Propaganda Fide. The congregation was founded in 1622, and the last document available arrived at the year 1958. From the homepage of this archive, in English, French, Spanish translation, it is also possible to try to find a description of the series. Then you have also the most important publication available and the official inventory edited by Kowalski and Metzler, Inventory of Historical Archive of the Sacred Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples, the Propaganda Fide, and also more targeted and specific tools. For example, I quoted the work of Gray and Chambers material for West African history and in the Italian archives, which also include the Archivio de Propaganda Fide. In the final part of my presentation, I will address 3 points. First, I will discuss the most surprising things I discovered during my archival research on African and American slavery from the Roman perspective. I was surprised by the contrast between the initial doubts expressed by the missionaries in their documents and the rigid, impersonal responses given by the Roman institutions. There was a discrepancy between the reality described by the missionaries and the answers provided by Rome, that in some occasions decided to remain also silent. It seems to me like a dialogue of the deaf. Now I understand this challenging aspect better. The dossier you can consult are stratified documentations because the process of issuing a response was intricate. The Secretary of the Holy Office translated the request received from the missionaries into a grid of dubia, each item beginning with the question, is it legit, unlicet? The task of resolving those questions fell to a theologian or a canon lawyer who prepared a written evaluation called a votum. This votum was then discussed by the Holy Office consultors and theologians, resulting in approval or rejection. Significant disagreement could prompt a second or even a third votum, which was subject to further discussion. Based on these deliberations, the Cardinal Inquisitor issued a written statement, either a legally binding decrees or a pastoral instructions. Episcopate, religious order, and Catholic sovereign were bound to obey the decree of the Suprema Roman Tribunal. Because the Holy Office relied on its own theologians, finally the decision usually aligned with the vota, though exceptions existed. Secondly, the problem or challenge I have to confront and how I manage them. I was fortunate at the beginning of my research when I found early modern copies of the original documents, which were produced using expertise from the mid-18th century. This coup de chance gave to me a sort of guide. However, after that, I need to conduct a lot of research activity to reconstruct the framework of it and the general picture of the 50 case of slavery and the slave peoples I found. Only later I realized I needed to understand the local situations very well to compare the points of view of the missionaries and local actors, as well as the neophytes and the slave people, with the Roman views. I managed this document with patience, and I forced myself to produce detailed translation from Latin and other languages. Third and last point, I would like to offer some advice to scholars who are pursuing archival research in these archives. The complex and stratified archives require practice, which can only be achieved through spending time in the archives and asking for the help of more experienced scholars. Otherwise, it is easy to either not find the documents you are searching for or to misunderstand them. I would call these the luminescent beetle for lanterns effect. I really thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Maria Teresa. The project is so complex, and it helped to see it in diagram, and the research you've done is really exciting, and I think we've learned a lot. So thank you so much. I want to turn to Patrick now.
Hi, everybody. I am going to share my slideshow. Let's see here. There we go. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
So I'm going to begin. Whoop. Jumping the gun just a little bit. There we go. All right. So I'd like to begin with a short set of anecdotes. It kind of builds on what Maria ended with. They're part of my experience. It's going to sound a little patronizing, but I think it's worth it to mention them. So Mary indicated that I had spent a little time in Sierra Leone. That was in 2010. My work there was part of the Catholic mission in the Diocese of McKinney. And at the time, it was headed by an Italian bishop, a Xaverian, who had a doctorate from Marquette. He was a Vatican II bishop and someone, I think, who was willing to consult widely, even a visitor like me. I was very surprised and also very gladdened when he took counsel for me on occasion and let me into the world of his pastoral service to the diocese. We traveled quite a bit together. So one day in his kitchen, he treated me to lunch. And, an Italian Zavarian bishop, all he has for lunch is a bowl of pasta. So we were sharing this bowl, and I asked him, Bishop, would it be okay if I saw the diocesan archive? And he was very surprised at the question and said, wait right here. He went upstairs to his room and brought back a shoebox.
Yeah.
And he presented it to me very proudly. Here are all of my pastoral letters. And that was the state of the archive. So, the grand illusions of somebody from the West who has resources for days to be presented with a shoebox of pastoral letters, a bit of a letdown. But two things I gleaned from that little experience. First of all, you don't know what's out there until you ask. Ask the question, what have you got? What could possibly be of interest to anybody, including me? But then, even if you get a dearth of material, you'll understand more about the context of the archive. You'll know what's hidden or what's missing. And so in the case of the Diocese of McKinney, you come to realize very quickly that Sierra Leone's civil war decimated church archives. And quite frankly, the bishop is lucky to be alive. He had to escape to Guinea to escape violence often. And so the archives were secondary. It's also instructive on how to do archival research from a conflict zone. There are lots of these places out there. Some of them are better off than others, but we do our best. So a second anecdote. This one deals with language and fear, and I really empathize with folks who dip their toes into Maria's pond. I had occasion to work for several days in the Vatican, Jesuit, and Propaganda Fide archives many years ago. And so for someone with minimal facility in Italian, I found it daunting. The playing field between the gatekeepers and the inquirer is not very balanced. But by a stroke of luck, while working in the ASV, I discovered that the file numbers for the items that I was hoping to search didn't match what was brought out to me. So I went back to the desk. I had a conversation with the archivist, who was mortified at the mistake. So suddenly the playing field became a little bit more equal. I did this very quietly. You want to preserve the good face of the clerk, but the profundo apologia was very evident, and so I knew, I'm going to get what I want. And really, this is the goal. You're in a strange place, working in a strange language, looking at things that may appear odd, or at least are out of the ordinary. But when you get past your ego, really you can get down to brass tacks and get things done. And the last anecdote. Consider the information that you want is either accessible or inaccessible.
I'm on a webinar.
It's either important or it's not. 3 times in the last 6 months, I've entertained inquiries from doctoral students in Europe and Brazil about items of significance for their thesis that are housed in my archive. They would love it if I could scan thousands of pages of documents for them and send them to them. And my answer to each one has been a resounding no. If you want knowledge, you come and get it. That is the basic bottom line, especially for archivists who are minding their own shop alone. We just don't have time to do stuff like that. We don't have the equipment often enough. If you want to contribute to the knowledge industry, you have to find the money to get on a plane. You have to find the time. And frankly, you have to have the guts to do the work. No one else is going to do it for you. So please, please have mercy on the archivist and just show up. All right. I'm going to tell you that it is not always an easy thing to do that. I recognize that. But when you do, you get to work in places like this, and it's spectacular. Last year, I made a research trip through England, Belgium, and the Netherlands. And this was connected to work I was doing on a sainthood cause. It was exhilarating, and not least because of the scholarly contacts and professional contacts that I made in the process. So the previous year, I did a paper in Innsbruck before an international audience, an invitation for which emerged from the work I did for the ACHA on the Native American boarding schools. And I coupled this trip with a diversion to Prague, where I was able to use the famed Strahov Abbey Library and its recently cataloged collection of Redemptoristica, which was deposited there when the communists suppressed the religious houses in Prague. This particular collection is not just about Redemptorists. It's an important and untapped resource for the study of Czech migration to the United States. The librarian is waiting for you, scholars of immigration, to come and visit him and work in this gorgeous spot. So much for anecdotes. For this presentation, I was asked to describe my collections here in Philadelphia. It's also not an easy task to get your arms around this place, since we can, what we have can help, it can help in understanding people, places, ideas that cross over oceans and continents and generations. It is a global archive. There are about 1 million paper documents, about 30,000 books in our specialized library, which support those. It supports the paper collections. We have several hundred rare books. We have over 40,000 print photographs, including scores of photograph albums. We probably have over 10,000 slides and negatives, plus another 50,000 or so digital images, and that is growing by leaps and bounds. You can add to that scrapbooks, textile, statuary, film, and other media, and hundreds of wall hangings, some of which date to the 13th century. Our oldest objects include a biblical coin collection, pieces of which date to 1100 BCE. Our oldest manuscript in the archive dates to about the 1390s. It's an Arma Christi scroll, which has been the subject of some scholarly attention. We've had 2 books written on it. So we're chipping in to the knowledge of Catholic life. There is much that connects the story of Redemptorists to their European confreres, and so the experience of the 19th century and early 20th century immigrant is amply described in our personnel files, our parish files, and other contemporary sources. Redemptorists settled in every major American city, and so the house annals, the daily diaries of their lives and ministries, are of particular significance. Their work is linked to and illustrated in other religious archives, especially those of the Redemptorist General House in Rome. There's lots and lots of correspondence from the American side that resides over there. And fortunately for you all, I spent a month over there, courtesy of the D'Agostino Fellowship that the Cushwa Center provides, assembling the finding aids for that material. This is just an example of, it's a small sampling of what we have here. It's the citizenship petition of a man who's on his way to sainthood. We could talk about the impact of religious orders on mission history, the shaping of neighborhoods, the fashioning of social networks, and the financing of evangelization. In New York's Lower East Side, the Redemptorists had a parish, Most Holy Redeemer, which also had a bank. It helped to underwrite missions abroad. It only ceased with the introduction of banking regulations in the early 20th century. And at that time, the Redemptorists were becoming plentiful in numbers, and the financial strength of the congregation was such that it could expand into mission territories, forming a web of new ties formed among people in the Caribbean, Canada, Brazil, Thailand, and Nigeria. Much more could be said about the people who have been served by Redemptorists. For instance, refugee populations have been in their orbit. So after 1975, with the flows of refugees from South Asia, especially Vietnam, Redemptorists harbored them in American cities where the congregation had a presence. And more recently, the Khmu, who settled on the West Coast, especially in the Bay Area, have been given pastoral care by Redemptorists and their collaborators. Whether during war or in peacetime, Redemptorists have had great numbers of military chaplains. And during World War II, they ran the military ordinariate office. You can find them in migrant ministry, urban ministry, the apostolate of the pen, and other venues. And I've tried to collect as much as I can in relation to these efforts. And in fact, I am waiting for you to come and see them. I'm going to conclude by just saying that I have a certain fear, but also a hope that scholars will turn their attention more to Redemptorist history, and we need it. The last general history of the Baltimore province, which began this place, it was printed in 1963. We haven't had an updated general history of the work of the Redemptorists, at least in the East, since then. And in a couple of years, they're all going to merge across 4 language groups. So French Canadians, Mexicans, Vietnamese based in Houston, Texas, and English-speaking Americans, East and West, are all coming together into one general North American province because of the dint of numbers. But the other units in the congregation have no idea about the history of the North American presence of their own members. So we need an updating. There's also lots of information here on Vatican II. So we had 4 Paridi who were very active at the council, one of which has been completely ignored by Vatican II scholars. And he is largely responsible for the inclusion of Marian texts. The lines that you might find in Lumen Gentium owe themselves to the work of an American Redemptorist. And yet, we don't have much scholarship on him. Additionally, we have Bernard Herring's American lectures that he gave in the interregnum periods during Vatican II. no one has touched those either. So there's an awful lot of possibility here, not only for the study of American Catholicism, but the ways in which the American Church has impacted the world and the world it. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Patrick. It's such a fascinating history. And I love the idea for potential avenues of scholarship that have yet been untapped. So thanks so much for that. Last, we have Bubbles.
Thank you very much. May I share my PowerPoint slides? Thank you very much.
Yes, go ahead.
So first of all, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, almost 11 p.m. here in Seoul, South Korea, where I am based for my fieldwork for a fellowship. So I would like to thank the organizers, Tuan, Mary, for inviting me to share my work on, I would call, archivally informed research on global Catholicism, but from the perspective of Asia, and mainly within the discussion of international migration, but touching on the long-standing local and global dichotomies and how this duality is almost counterproductive, as touched by Maria and Patrick. Now we have what Robertson would call the glocality. So I would be touching on that when it comes to the local actors, the Asians, the locals, and the missionaries being, representing the global. So let me first make a huge disclaimer here that I'm not a historical sociologist, and historical sociologists are the sociologists who mostly use archival data within the field of sociology, nor am an expert in the employment of archival data the way historians and archivists are in the traditional sense. But however, in my work as a sociologist of religion, migration, and organizations, I used archival method alongside other methods in what we call as, of course, triangulation, right? So there are 4 areas of research, in my research, that I employed archival method alongside other research methods. And in sociology, archival research is being used to craft sociological questions. And I will also share within each area of research the surprising discoveries, the challenges encountered, and how I kind of address them. And then hopefully I could cover all of these in such a short time, but I'll try my best. So let me go to my work in South Korea. So at the beginning, I was quite interested in looking at the role of the Catholic Church in migrant incorporation very contemporarily from 1990s to mid-2000s. However, as I was doing my ethnography of Catholic migrant centers in South Korea between 2012 and 2013, and then I revisited, I discovered that I was accidentally, maybe not, but quite entangled with the history, with the narratives and accounts of the history of the Korean Catholic Church. So in that case, I did not have a choice. My supervisors were saying, do you need to look into it? But I believe I would. I needed it because the main argument of the research was that the Catholic Church, not necessarily Korean, but globally and locally, usually would serve as what I would call as migrant serving mediating structure, borrowing from Berger and House. So this is a very American-centric idea. The mediating structure would be the neighborhood, churches, family, and whatnot. And these mediating structures would stand between the isolated and alienated individuals vis-a-vis the macro structures. And I adapted this. But to establish this claim, I needed to trace what changes and historical events shaped what I was claiming the Korean Catholic Church was serving in its mediatory role. Hence, archival data sources of the Korean Catholic Church was needed. So this was from 18th century under Joseon Dynasty until the democratic consolidation period in the 1980s. So what were the archival data sources? So I had to look into a close reading of historical accounts from the CBCK, their official accounts of what their narratives and history of the Korean Catholic Church. And I chose, and I think Patrick mentioned the translation. So most of these are translations in English available online. I visited the CBCK office. They are in physical form, but they already digitalized it, so they were available online. However, I was kind of worried that these official accounts may have what I would call omissions or archival absences, silences, and omissions. And these omissions may be coming from, forgive me for saying this, but would be coming from the biases of the archivists. So I was worried about that it would be controlled and limited, and the materials are not sufficiently provided with context in terms of the metadata that the archivist provided. So I scoured all books translated in English, and some I have them translated, which was very expensive, from different libraries across the top universities and the Catholic universities around Korea. However, I was surprised because my initial assumptions, again, would be coming from that the official Catholic account of history would have very predetermined stories which were told and which would leave traces because they were translated in English. They have a very target audience. So they have the international audience that they are catering to. So following anthropologist David Zitlin, he was saying that archives in this way are instruments of hegemony. And I would say these are the official account, the missionary account. And in fact, in South Korea, the MEPs, the French missionaries, they just have opened their archival account, their archival database, which is now available online, but they are all in French. So I would call that kind of archives as instruments of quote unquote hegemony, vis-a-vis, according to Zetlin, archives as instruments of subversion, where I think Patrick mentioned this, like a shoebox of newsletters and pastoral letters. So excavating other hidden or silenced voices. And this is leading us to think that we are not complete prisoners of archives. We often think of archives in a very objective way, that they are places where everything is cataloged and whatnot, but they are determined. But then again, when we think of archives as instruments of subversion, we can consider and regard other voices. So this is where researchers would be quite interested in. So, however, we are saying as well that every ethnography, every history, and every archive is positioned or biased in one way or another. This does not, however, even if they are biased, we cannot just give up of making archival research, abandon them, or making them worthless. Rather, we must deal with what we call as reflexivity, know what our positionality and privileges or the biases of the accounts. So I was covering the CBCK or the Catholic Bishop Conference account of the history of the Korean Catholic Church. You can see here, which I highlighted, that there are examples of the voices of subversion that the archival data showed by explaining how the missionaries in the Catholic Church at the time were passive and silent against the Japanese colonial authorities by employing the separation of the church-state logic. And this church-state separation of the church-state is very Western, very European, and very French, basically because these are French missionaries. And they were very strategic because of the history of the Korean Catholic Church of martyrdom and persecution, that in exchange of religious freedom and to avoid persecution that the Catholic Church experienced under the Joseon dynasty, that they didn't want that to happen under the Japanese colonization. And here, furthermore, in one of the accounts, there is another evidence of the quiet passivity and silence of the Korean Catholic Church under the missionary leaders. It says here it did not make direct contribution, which I find very fascinating because I did not expect it from the official account of the Korean Catholic Church. But here they were very critical that it says here they tolerated the Japanese policy of aggression. However, they tone it down. They had a word of caution here that it it was done against the will of the church. But the data pushed the critique further by stating that the evangelization of the Korean people after the national independence would have been more productive if the church made a sincere self-examination of the errors of the past, but it did not. This kind of narrative is quite similar to the way the Koreans would describe the Japanese, that they never make a public apology for the atrocities done on Korea, and it is still a very much public debate surrounding this. The text here showed that the context at the time was too complex, kind of a disclaimer, but however, tone it down again and very strategic in the narratives that the Korean Catholic Church continued to do missionary works in the field of education, social work, and other, developing social institutions, but not engaging in the political sphere. So the archival materials here, I adhere to what Ben Zikri and colleagues posit, that archival materials go beyond objects. They go beyond text. I mentioned here the excavating of other voices, but the materials from the archives assembled in the past and present with differing purposes and goals in mind. I, as a researcher, I have a different purpose and goals in mind how I'm going to use the archival data. So my intention is to engage with the historical materials in the present and trying to think through these very tensions of temporality. And temporality here is the experience of the subjective, the collective, and objective experiences of social time and historical moments. So what I did was to juxtapose the official classifications or taxonomy that the Korean Catholic Church made, and I interpreted it as that the Catholic narratives of solidarity with migrants fast forward to the contemporary times, and this is where I'm trying to make sense of the relevance of historical accounts. I employed this concept of historical experiential parallelism, whereby the registry or the narratives or the discourse of minoritization of the Korean Catholic Church from persecution, martyrdom, and ghettoization. I call it ghettoization because of its passivity from the public sphere during the colonial period, and eventually the public engagement whereby the missionaries are already gone in the Korean soil. And then that's the beginning of the first cardinal, the Korean local, quote unquote, native clergies and leaders of a hierarchy. So in so many ways, I claim that there is a kind of very strategic, but in a continuum, but very pragmatic of when the Catholic Church would disengage with the state, with the society, and what are the consequences that would come from these strategies. And this is not very particular in the Korean context. We can see here globally how the papacy, how the national churches would use this, when to be quiet, when to be passive, and when to engage. And migration is one of the issues that the Korean Catholic Church would use a very strategic positioning vis-a-vis the state and vis-a-vis the society. So if there is a funding, then they would make cooperation with the state. If the public clamor is for the migrants, but then against the universal teaching of the church, of the Catholic Church about migrants and the strangers and the foreigners, then they would have an opposing or contradictory narratives. So I further kind of classify chronologically how they engage with the state by coming up with the memory of blood. The martyrdom is very strong and very dominant narratives within the Korean Catholic Church, and they use it as a justification for their passivity sometimes, that they don't want to be further persecuted, so they rather be passive. However, in the 1970s, and this is the so-called sign of times, where many countries were going through democratization, I call this the Catholic Golden Age. vis-a-vis public engagement. And then in the early 90s and 2000s, migration became a context and a new cause for social justice and for engagement with the state or disengagement with the state. My other area of research is, so coming from my PhD project, I treated the Korean Catholic Church as what James Coleman, the sociologist, calls the appropriable social organization. So the argument of the research, one of the papers that I'm working on, is that the Catholic migrant centers are organizations established for one purpose, but repurposed for different or additional purposes. Again, this is not a monopoly of the Catholic Church, Korean Catholic Church. You can also see these among the Catholic agencies across the globe, across nations, across localities. They are very good and very successful in repurposing the so-called religious capital, spiritual capital, and convert them and mobilize them to perform other roles and functions. So the religious capital is converted to other forms of capital coming from Purdue and all the social capital theorists, and convert them to economic, cultural, social, symbolic capital that the migrants need in their migrant incorporation. Right. Whether the church intentionally wants to do it, but maybe not, but because of the function and because of the structure of the Catholic Church, globally, nationally, locally, they are able to appropriate itself into other functions. So operationally, I look at the migrant centers being transformed into different purposes, such as it serves the role as a quasi-state agencies through co-optation with the so-called multiculturalism projects of the state in South Korea. They sometimes serve as social workers. They sometimes serve as legal assistance centers, health assistance, and multi-purpose centers. And we can also see this in other contexts. Now, why the need for archival data? Because I can do that using ethnography. I needed the archival data, and what archival data sources I used to trace the shifts, and this is where sociologists would find archival data very important and very salient by tracing changes, by tracing continuities of the migrant needs vis-a-vis the Catholic services. Past accounts are needed to juxtapose the present and contemporary Catholic migrant initiatives and programs. However, in South Korea, there is no pathway for citizenship and permanent settlement. Most migrant workers could only stay legally between 3 and 9 years because they stay. And so with Japan, and so with China, Singapore, so there are no pathways except marriage migration. So the use of Filipino Catholic community newsletters called Sambayanan from 1993 to 2013 was used, and it was a monthly issued, stored in a very shabby cabinet. And then I have to scour through them, and then there's no cataloging, so I have to do it myself as a form of help to the community. So I arranged them by month. And there were a total of 240 newsletters that I needed to excavate, collect, and then analyze. So here's an example of a 2010. And usually some of these newsletters would include the same things. Until now, they still include the same things: photos, poetry written by the migrants themselves. Sanaysay means essay, and usually it's about policy, migration regimes, migration policy. There would be 2 or 3 pages about Catholic catechism. But for me, the most important thing about archival data, again, what is my purpose of using the archival data, is the community announcements, ulat comunidades, the announcements about the community. I usually check if for example, the migrant counseling centers for migrant women would be the same from 2010 and until now 2025. I'm back here. I would check, I would call them again. So these are the same pastoral centers. This is in 2010, but they are still existing. Then I also check who are the sponsors and what kind of services that they still provide. Now, the findings and sociological questions that I crafted from these archival data would be: what resources do the Catholic migrant centers possess and accrue, which they mobilize to produce caring practices and caring institutions for migrants? what caring practices for migrants have been enacted, and what are the consequences. So the results of these is the particularity of the narratives and practices of the Catholic pastoral care for migrants, and usually, and this is triangulated with my interviews with the migrant center workers and the migrants themselves, that they differentiate themselves from social work and other state-orientated care for migrants, whereby migrants are cases, and it's a number. They help one case and two cases, but according to Catholic migrants' narratives, is that migrants for them are humans. So if one migrant is very ill with cancer, they have to see through the entire chemotherapy and the entire until the migrant becomes better. Or if unfortunately they pass away, the Catholic Church would still provide how to repatriate the body and then provide all the legal documents. So they see through the entire process, and this is how they think of the narrative of migrant as humans as opposed to the migrant as a case. Now, the particularity of the Catholic Church as well is they have a lot of resources. This may be cultural capital, not necessarily economic capital, because some of the migrant centers do not possess liquid cash and they have to apply for grants, but they have symbolic and cultural capital, cultural capital in the way that they have the so-called Verdusian idea of habitus, that they know what to do, because transnationally they have been doing this through experience and for such a long time. Now, what are the challenges that I encountered? Mostly content-based issues. Again, I'm very particular and very worried about the biases and omissions and the silences that these newsletters provided and demonstrated. Now, fast forward. So now I'm working.
Bubbles, quickly, just about, you have about 4 minutes left.
Yes. These are some of the final. So I'm now working on digital archiving. So from the newsletters, and now I'm doing the digital archiving as a coordinator of the Initiative for the Study of Asian Catholics, which is now based in De La Salle University in Manila. The rationale is to decenter the production and circulation of knowledge and on data on Asian Catholics and Catholicism. I put this in parentheses because Asian Catholic is more the lived religion. Asian Catholicism is more on the organized religion. And we aim to have a repository of data that would be useful to current and future researchers on the social scientific study of Asian Catholics. So we are working on this, the oral history of Asian Catechist. These are our sample materials from Sri Lanka. We're also digitalizing the Chinese couplets, the Lunar New Year Chinese couplets, and these are photos. We are also archiving the migration series of pastoral guide on how to do the migrant ministry. So this is another project that I'm working on, which is to have a database of the media coverages of the trip of Pope Francis in Asia. Now, the digital archiving is a change of positionality, and the archives serve as mediators who bridge times, place, and people. But at the same time, archives in this way, because we're covering a lot of contemporary materials here, is a liminal phase between memory and forgetting. And in so many ways, this is part of the politics of ephemerality, according to Taylor, the power to choose what to preserve, what to remember, or what to forget. Right. The challenge of digital archiving is, of course, funding, very long process of obtaining legal and ethical clearance in terms of copyright issues and data privacy. Now, the last project that I am working on is the case of the Archivo Franciscano Filipino, which is the narratives of conversion and evangelization and modernity from the global South, specifically Latin America and Southeast Asia. However, the localization here, because I don't have much time, is what is interesting here is the shift of online archival presence. Because this archive museum doesn't have enough money and space, what they do is to target to kinds of audience, the researchers and the larger public. For the larger public, they started with what I call as digital storytelling, making the historical data relevant to contemporary times. And if you can see it, they also do a kind of cataloging of photos, of historical explanations and historical narratives. And I am trying to push the case and analysis here that it is a liminal phase between memory and forgetting so that the archives could become a kind of touchstones to provide whatever affordances they are capable of offering. So for example, here, I'm very surprised that a lot of people are engaging with these Facebook pages of Archivo. Like 99 people would like it, and some people would really engage, and they say, oh, this is the parish of my ancestors. And they would engage with the public by saying, if you have other photos of these particular structure within the church that they call the church Santuario de San Antonio, please contact us. So it's a kind of public engagement using the archives. So the takeaway here is archival work is a qualitative sociology as well, and there must be the intention to follow methodological rules in archival research in the way that archivists and historians use it. Archives are necessary as a sociological proof and evidences, but it must be established that we follow the rules of engaging, of the need for empirical certainty, the need for verifiability, and triangulation of data. So I end my presentation here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Bubbles and all the presenters. We do have some time for Q&A, so feel free to raise your hand, ask our panelists, any or all of them. And I also saw that there are a couple of comments in the chat as well. Anybody want to speak, to ask anything?
It looks like Deborah Cantor has a question, and Patrick as well. Deborah, do you want to pose your question?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thank you, wherever you are in the world. So a lot of great threads running through these very diverse presentations, thinking about missions in different time periods, migrations in the 19th century as opposed to migrations now, like it's the same words, but they're very different things. And one of the questions that I have, I feel like it's a pretty new topic and there's not a lot written about it, but the topic of mission in reverse, the growing presence of Asian, Latin American, African sisters and priests in the US and Canada. I think this is also true in Europe, but I'm not really sure. And this is obviously, it strikes me as an unexpected fruit of these, 19th and 20th century efforts of the global North to missionize to the global South. But I will open it up to y'all. Thank you.
Would any of our panelists like to tackle it?
If I may? Yeah, so Korea and the Philippines, not recently, but in the past 10 to 20 years, the narratives of the Catholic Church in these two countries would be that the Filipinos are the new evangelizers and the new missionaries, filling up pews and spaces in Europe. And Koreans would have a lot of materials now being written that from being potters, meaning they are the marginalized and minoritized church, now they are the missionaries being sent overseas. So yes, I appreciate this comment from Deborah that there is now a kind of mission in reverse, and this is not just true among Filipinos, also the Vietnamese and other Asians going to what we call as the receiving societies. And there are slowly emerging, growing body of literature on this.
Patrick?
I can also speak to this a little bit. In a concrete way, the Redemptorists are um, undergoing this. Not all religious orders are, but about 6 years ago, 7 years ago, the one of the American provinces entered into a relationship agreement with the Vietnamese province. And the deal was the very wealthy Baltimore province would essentially pay for the education at Boston College of 5 Vietnamese Redemptorists, with the proviso that after they graduate,
Mm.
they um, they commit to 3 years of ministry. Some have actually completed their studies, they've engaged in the ministry, and now they've petitioned to stay. Some have returned to Vietnam. But the ones who have stayed, all young guys, are either pastoring unusual places, like in the Caribbean, and one fellow is actually the vocation director. So there's room for growth. This is the consequence of being a global congregation. So 77 countries allows for this kind of interchange. But it has changed the dynamic radically of how the confreres relate to one another. Very interesting.
It wouldn't surprise me if in about 10 years we will have like this old global Catholicism history and then the new primarily because of that. Rob, please.
Yeah, I would say those are two excellent, and this question is an excellent question. I would say one of the things here is, which I saw a lot in the China experience in the archives, is passports and citizenship structure and who's allowed into countries and who's not. I think that this is a very important topic because whatever in the United States situation, allowance and visa for work, for ministry, it's a very specialized dynamic here. The other thing is, with religious orders, it's one dynamic. With diocesan structures, it's another dynamic. And education, it's another dynamic. So racism in the American society is critical. Diocesan structures and race in the diocesan structures or the people who come internationally in this population, which I think is a very rich one, in the new mission in reverse, face the racism of the local people or the invitation of the local people. And I just think this is a rich area to explore.
Patrick has a question on the chat as well. I like the question. And maybe it's aimed at the audience. Have anybody had a bad experience visiting archives? Maria? I thought that you are ready to speak or something. I'm just kidding. Anyone?
Okay, I'll jump in.
Okay. All right, Deborah.
So I just finished a book about the Claretian missionaries in the United States. And part of that was I decided to focus one chapter. Most I was talking about within the United States, but one chapter about their 20th century missions in Central America. And I had a ton of material at the Claretian Archive in Chicago, but I was like, I should really go down. And like, what's at the Central American Claretian Archive? And I wrote nada, nothing, right? Like no response. So then I get like the provincial superior to like write to somebody from me. And then I get like a 2 sentence response of like, we wouldn't have anything for you. And like if you're going to Panama, you have to plan, right? I got to figure out the plane ticket and when and like, I'm not going to go down there on the chance that they will open the door and let me look at the shoe boxes. But yeah. So I can think of times where I've tried to go to an archive in Guadalajara. I was there, like, the door was shut. I could not go in. I went in the plaza and I cried, right? It was like dissertation research. How will I ever write my dissertation? I went back 10 years ago. I wrote in advance. I never heard back, but I just sort of went on a wing and a prayer, and I got in and I had a great 5 days. But it's like I'm very much a guest, and sometimes people are not responsive, and it's challenging. And I feel really bad. I couldn't get sort of more of I think, a truly Central American, take on the historic record. I tried to do it as much as I could, given what was in Chicago.
Thank you.
My sad story.
Yeah. Deborah, I've had something somewhat similar as well, just working in some archives in Quebec, and it seems often, and maybe this is not your experience, but sometimes, just like corporations, when they get too big or unresponsive or really difficult to find a human being who will listen to your story or your research questions, have found that almost the bigger the archive, the harder it is. And I'm sure Teresa could relate here, but for me, some of my most difficult experiences with archives have been with the bigger ones, like the Bibliothèque Archives Nationales de Québec. And I will try to describe my project in a relatively coherent and concise manner. And then the response I get is, we have, same as your experience, we have nothing relevant to what you're interested in. But I know they do, but they're just as, sometimes it can be hard to break through. So that can be frustrating. What I would appreciate, Patrick, you asked, what could we do to improve? I think in those circumstances, for me, what would have been better is just a willingness to say, can you tell me a little bit more about your project? Or can you, I'm open for a 10-minute Zoom call or something like that. Because so many of these things that we're interested in require a little bit more of a conversation. I think I did see a hand, but I want to be respectful of people's time as well. So I think what we'll do is, I think we should probably stop. But one of the things I wanted to say was this is the second of 3 planned webinars or virtual meetings on global Catholicism. And what Tuan and I were hoping to do in October is workshop someone's book chapter, article, conference presentation, something on a theme related to global Catholicism. So I know most of you are working on something like this, or maybe have students or colleagues who might be willing to contribute a chapter, article, whatever, for us to workshop. So please think about this. Please consider it. We'd love to just have this article maybe a month ahead of time in September. So that would give you about 3 months. And then we can send it out to the group and hopefully have a really helpful feedback session on it. So do consider that. We'll send out more formal requests for this sort of thing later. But thank you so much all for being here on this evening or morning or wherever it is. And we're just really appreciative that so many of you showed up, and we're especially grateful to our 4 panelists for sharing their experiences and expertise. And also, Tuan, thank you for your leadership in organizing this.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great